Hello and welcome. My name is Bo Adams, and I serve as director of Pitt's Theology Library here at Emory University, the home of the Richard C. Kessler Reformation Collection. I welcome you to our Spring 2021 Kessler Conversations, an opportunity to learn from experts about the debates and reforms in Europe in the 16th century, and to consider how contemporary communities can learn from them. This spring, our conversations take as their theme, Blessed are the Poor, Wealth and Poverty in the 16th and 21st centuries. I'm pleased to welcome today to the conversation Professor Esther Chung-Kim of Claremont McKenna College, where she serves as Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Associate Director of the Gould Center of Humanities. A PhD graduate of Duke University, Professor Chung-Kim teaches seminars on poverty, wealth, and social change, on European reformations, and on Christianity and politics in East Asia. Her research career is marked by many publications in the area of Reformation studies, notably on the use of the Church Fathers in Reformation Debates, and most recently on the reform of relief for the poor in the 16th century. Her visit today coincides well with the release this month of her newest book entitled Economics of Faith, Reforming Poor Relief in Early Modern Europe, which is available to all of us at the end of this month, published by Oxford University Press. So just after this conversation, I know we will all jump over to Amazon or your favorite bookseller and we'll pre-order the book. I know I already pre-ordered mine. So Professor Chung-Kim, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about reform of poor relief in the 16th century. And of course, congratulations on the new book. I'm very much looking forward to learning from you.
Thank you.
So before we get started with question and conversation, I want to note that if you're joining us live, I'd like for you to also be able to participate in the conversation. So as Professor Chung-Kim and I talk, you are welcome to enter any question you may have in the question and answer window on the right side of the screen. And as we have time at the end, I'll relay these questions to her. So to get started, I'd like to start with a very general question to provide some context for you and for your work. So can you help us understand your research and teaching interests, and then give us a sense of why you think it's important for your students and for us as the general public to understand the religious, cultural, and societal changes of Europe in the early 16th century, particularly around the issue of wealth and poverty?
Yes, thank you. Let me just give a special thanks for just this invitation. I'm really glad to be here. I have visited the library when we were allowed to, and so have fond memories of that. In response to your question about sort of my research and especially how it might be relevant to today, I think there's a couple of things. First, I would say that Europe actually serves as a model for many social welfare systems. And one of the reasons for that is they've had a long history of looking at social welfare problems, especially around poverty, and trying many different strategies to overcome a pretty ongoing problem. In addition, I think the other thing that motivates me to work in this area is I believe there's a lot of stereotypes around this subject matter. Often, for example, people assume that religion has been sort of detrimental. You hear this in the news today about how people who are religious might actually be against poor relief or social welfare. And actually, what you find here is they are at the forefront, especially religious reformers, whether they're Catholic humanists or Protestant reformers, they are at the forefront of social welfare reform. And then finally, I think it's also helpful to study just a different context, because sometimes when we're too involved in our current situation, it becomes too close for us to be objective. And I think one of the helpful things about studying history in a period that we have some distance from is that we can try to gain a more balanced view by looking at sort of who did it help, who did it not help, and really just get a sense of how might we get some possible ideas from studying the past for present problems.
That's wonderful. Thank you. To kind of turn to our topic in particular, I was surprised, and I assume that many may be surprised to learn that poverty in particular was kind of at the forefront of Luther's concerns, even from the beginning. So for example, in the 95 Theses, poverty comes up a number of times. So the 43rd thesis reads, quote, Christians are to be taught that he who gives to the poor or lends to the needy does a better deed than he who buys indulgences. So to kind of set the groundwork for the 16th century, can you help us understand maybe the long Christian tradition of support for the poor, and then to offer some clarification about the context into which Luther inserts this contrast of supporting the poor versus supporting the church?
Yeah, so one thing I would like to start off with is that the church has a long history already of supporting the poor from its early origins. So, in that sense, this is a continuity of concern for those who are marginalized, those who might be castaways. And as is well known during the Roman Empire, the Christians were the ones to adopt abandoned babies, for example. So I think to talk about the history of Christianity and the care for the poor, they go together in some ways. I think one of the things that we begin to see as far as shifts are concerned is that poor relief was still very much focused on individual giving. It was interpersonal charity, one to one. And one of the shifts you get in this early modern Europe is this movement towards centralization of poor relief funds and sources. So instead of having certain monasteries and certain cathedrals and certain poor relief all throughout, scattered throughout the cities, you see this movement to try to come up with a common fund or a common chest in which many of these funds are brought together to care for the poor in that city or in that neighboring region. So you begin to see that shift. The other context I want to bring up is a theological context, which is this shift between being poor was seen as virtuous. There was a virtue associated with poverty. And one of the shifts you begin to see is that this sort of separation from virtue and poverty. And in fact, for example, if you read someone like the commentaries of Calvin in the book of Acts, he'll actually start talking about the virtuous rich, the generous rich, the ones who use their wealth properly and rightly. So there's these shifts of mentality that are actually spurred by theological reform. Luther's notion of vocatio or vocation, the idea of calling, so that all work, not just religious work, but all work is holy work, something that sometimes I call sanctifying work. So, or he sanctified work in many ways and all kinds of work. So I think there is that kind of shift happening as well. And then lastly, I'll say begging was a really big problem at this time, partly because you had migration of people. So a lot of times you had beggars that were local, but you also had foreign beggars or stranger beggars or outsiders who were begging through towns. And to add to that, you had the mendicant orders, which were religious orders that were basically gained a lot of their sustenance through begging and had permission to beg in many different towns. So begging was considered for many a nuisance or a social problem. And so part of poor relief was, how do you get rid of beggars on the street? And an indication that poor relief is working well or properly is that you have no more beggars because they would be taken care of. Not that you would just get rid of them, but the idea that you would take care of them so they would have no need to beg. Right? So these are some of the contextual shifts that are happening.
So you mentioned before kind of poverty as a problem, a real practical problem, literally in the streets of some of these cities. Before the reformers and before these changes of the 16th century, what institutions were there to support the poor? And then I'm going to ask a question that probably reflects a false assumption, but were these civic institutions, were these governments supporting the poor, or was it the church supporting the poor, or can we parse out between those two things?
So most of the support so in medieval and earlier times, the support would have come from not just directly churches, but religious orders themselves. So monastic orders, convents, nuns, a lot of times they were set up in a way to help people who are on pilgrimage. So the way that I like to think about them is they were kind of a combination of hospital and hostel, like a youth hostel, right? Where people would stop. But a lot of times people would get sick or get weary and they would need to rest and restore themselves. So they kind of served as what I call the hospital/hostel kind of idea. The other group that was actually very active in caring for the poor were groups of lay people who came together in what we would call brotherhoods or confraternities. They basically, that's where we get the word fraternity. They basically would get together and decide that they were going to care for the poor either in their town or their region or in their particular guild. So if you had craftsmen who were of a particular trade, they might set up a confraternity to say, we're going to take care of all the tradesmen and their families who fall into poverty or sickness or some calamity hits them. So they would create these confraternities for that kind of purpose. And so that was another huge growth at this late medieval period where you begin to see lay people. But once again, they're motivated by religious ideals, right, to care for the poor. The other thing that's a continuity is this attention to widows and orphans. So care for the widows and orphans continues, and there is attention paid to that as well. So before this time, these are mostly not under civic control, although some cities were starting to move in that direction, but they couldn't get the foundations or these confraternities or the monasteries to give up their funds to put into a centralized fund. And so in some ways, the Reformation facilitated that.
So I want to get back to a point you raised earlier, which is the kind of theological underpinnings of some of this. We're in a school of theology, so we're always pushing the theological question. So your book is entitled Reforming Poor Relief. And I think typically someone like me thinks about the Reformation as a period of theological reform, right? We often operate under these slogans of righteousness of faith. But can you summarize what these more practical reforms about poor relief were in the period and how they are connected to theological reform? That is, does theological innovation itself drive the reforms that we see for the poor?
So this has been debated for decades. I think there was a generation of scholars who felt that, the Reformation brought about social welfare reform, and it was the Reformation that both instigated, created. They were the kind of origins of these ideas, kind of the incubators of these theological ideas, and therefore you get these changes. And then you got the flip side in the next group of scholars that said, no, it was really about political and economic necessity and change. The Reformation language was peripheral. It was just the language that the people understood, so they used it. But in reality, it was driven by sort of practical, sort of urgent economic considerations. I don't think these are mutually exclusive. I think that what ends up happening is there is this need, this economic need, and there is political leaders who want to address it. But I think the problem is still too big for any one group to handle. And so what ends up happening is when the reformers come to this scene, they are fully supportive of this shift to centralization and having civic authorities, lay people, be in charge of poor relief. They're also okay with giving up, the monasteries and the lands and having people not take religious vows, right? Because all work is holy. And so they're willing to, and encouraging of consolidating a lot of these resources for the poor. I mean, if you want to just be really practical, one of the things you begin to see is that the number of priests, local priests, or what we call lower priests, you need within the Catholic system to say the daily masses was a very high number. So in certain cities, there's a study of a city where the population is maybe 3,000 and they have 500 priests. I think what the Reformation does is it really slims it down. There are maybe in cities like that, the clergy are maybe 35 by the time they turn Protestant. So instead of 500 priests, you have 35 pastors. A lot of them are very overworked, and they talk about that. So I think one of the things you're seeing is the resources need to come from somewhere. But theologically speaking, not only is there's the idea of work, but when you look at how the reformers are gauging the progress of the Reformation, Lutheran reformers like Johannes Bugenhagen will write a letter to Luther saying, We know that the Reformation is progressing in cities like Hamburg because they have now set up schools, they have pastors preaching the word of God, and they have set up poor relief. So for them, these were sort of like the three indicators that religious reform, theological reform was taking root. And sometimes you have, the reformers complaining that the people are not sufficiently theologically aware and reforming fast enough because they don't give to poor relief, they don't support their pastors, and they're not interested in setting up schools. And so once again, in their minds, there is a connection. And because of that connection, even for some of the lay, they had begun to start connecting social welfare reform with Protestant reform. So that when you have someone like Catholic humanist Juan Luis Vives, who's writing about social welfare reform, they accuse him of Lutheran heresy. And he doesn't even mention it at all. All he simply says is, what if we centralize the resources and, begin a centralized poor relief system? And they're, oh, that smells of Lutheran heresy, right? So just the fact that that kind of accusation could come up means that in people's minds, these were starting to be associated together, even if in many cities, the reformers are not the original ideas of the, poor relief reform that were taking place.
But I was going to ask, do these reforms that we associate perhaps with the reformers often have an impact on the way in which Catholic institutions then supported poor, right? Is there kind of a concomitant response from the Catholic Church?
Yeah, so there's been various studies on sort of Catholic fraternities and Catholic poor relief. And one of the things is there is a general trend in this period to move toward that centralization. Part of it is because I already mentioned that the problem of begging had gotten a little bit out of control. And then there were abuses around the system. So certain people would what we call double dip, and they would just go around from different poor reliefs to get as much as they could. So in order to kind of curb that, and also the number of poor were growing, so they were always short on resources. So to try to be as fair as possible or distribute the goods to as many as possible, there was an effort to centralize and organize poor relief. That is true also in Catholic areas. You see them trying to centralize poor relief in some ways. Now, they're not as successful in some ways because they still keep their religious orders. So in Catholic areas, you still have religious orders that are in place, and some of them still have licenses to beg, right? So they will have permission to do so. But even in certain Catholic areas, you will see that the way they centralize the poor is they actually try to move all the poor into the same area. So they'll like put them in a monastery together, all the poor. They'll like gather them from all over the city, put them into one place. And even then, there's still this emphasis on interpersonal charity. So they'll match a particular family who's struggling and poor, maybe single mom with kids, something like that, and they'll match that with a wealthy family. And they'll say, this wealthy family will be in charge of this other family and take care of them and give to them. So there was still, even in this centralization effect, still that interpersonal charity was still a factor in the way they thought about it. So you still see that in Catholic areas. Nevertheless, the movement, the effort, even if they did it slightly differently, the movement towards centralization was a trend at this time.
So this may be a hard question to answer, but I'm curious. We talked about before that poverty was a big issue. There were a lot of poor people. I've seen numbers up to maybe a third of the population in certain areas was considered poor or vagrant. What practical impact did some of these changes make? Are there groups that benefited more than others? Obviously, poverty continued to be a problem in Europe, but what was the impact on some of these groups?
Yeah, so one of the things I looked up recently was, did it really make a dent in poverty, right? And I think that it's tricky because there's no one answer. So if you ask someone who was helped by poor relief and was able to get out of poverty, I'm sure it helped them. Others, I'm sure it didn't help as much if they couldn't figure out a way to actually get out of poverty and just, they would just remain dependent. But one of the sort of the three categories of people that I think would have felt the effects or the help or the assistance of poverty, one would have been the students. At this time, there was an effort to get poor boys and girls to read. One of Luther's call to the councilmen were throughout all the cities in Germany was create a school or hire a tutor or a teacher for the poor boys and girls. And so even if you look at a church order of Braunschweig, you will see that Bugenhagen writes this phrase in under schools about if a poor person wants his daughter to go to school, right, which is pretty radical at this time, then he should go to the deacons and make sure the deacons can support them so the daughter can go to school and learn to read. So the sort of awareness of students, if you look at some of the writings, you see the reformers constantly writing to wealthier patrons and saying, can you support this student, in the university? Can you support their studies and their living expenses? And this is for example, this is a constant issue, concern that comes up between Bugenhagen and King Christian III in Denmark. They will go back and forth. And in the letters, there's this constant reference to this student might need help. This student is a poor student, but very capable. And so we should support this student. And at one point, King Christian III in Denmark actually writes to Bugenhagen and says, hey, you haven't asked me to fund any students lately, and I'm ready to fund them. He actually says, I am ready to fund students. Let me know if you need any, student scholarships. Basically, that's what he's saying. And Bugenhagen goes, well, actually, now that you mention it, then he mentions a few people. So there is this effort to support students. Even in Calvin's Geneva, when you look at the wills, one of the things that people will leave money to in their will and last testament is to students for the academy, right? These are scholarships for students in the academy. And then one last thing I would say about students is they were one of the groups that was allowed to beg. Students were sometimes given special permission to beg. And some of the reformers talk about how they had to beg for their supper. And usually they did it through singing, right? They would sing for their supper. And that was their form of begging, right? So students, I think, poor students who were capable were given a chance. And many of the reformers would have understood this because they themselves were partly in the upwardly mobile class as well. The other group that would have been supported are the pastors. Now, part of this is tricky because pastors or priests in the late medieval system would have received benefices. So their needs would have been taken care of to some degree. But once the system changes and it becomes centralized, the pastors actually initially are pretty poor themselves, unless they have a professorship job at a university at the same time, like Luther did, and Bugenhagen did as well. But if you didn't have that and you were a pastor in a church without the professorship or without a second job, money was tight. And then to add to that, you have to remember these clergy are now often married clergy. And then once they're married, they obviously can have families. So the care for pastors or the need for pastors and their financial support actually increased while the actual avenues of support for them decreased. So the first generations of pastors you get will write letters to like Luther, because some of them are Luther students, and they'll say things like, I might have to leave the pastor position because my family is starving, or I might have to get another job. And so one of the pushes in some of this poor relief reform is to include the care for pastors. Bugenhagen's church order has a whole section on salary for pastors and housing for pastors. Those are two things that he's very clear on. And he also includes his salary and housing for teachers. For him, pastors and teachers are kind of doing the same work. They're educating people in, formation. So, and then finally, I will add that with the reformers, some of them start what I call foreigner funds. So when they are minority communities, the most famous example would be Calvin's Geneva. When the French come into Geneva, they create a fund just for foreign refugees. And so refugee funds, very unique thing in the 16th century to care for foreigners and outsiders. But this is one area that the Reformed Church, and this is the one area also that goes away from centralization of the civic authorities or political authorities. Care for refugees always fell to the churches. The stranger churches in London, the Reformed churches in the Netherlands, Reformed churches in German areas. So one of the sort of innovations, if you will, is care for foreigners or foreign refugees were established through deacons in the churches.
So if I got you right, education is the way out of poverty, and you should support your pastors. So we in theological education are very happy to hear these lessons from the Reformation, and then support for foreigners, and that's a group that benefited. So in all seriousness, I want to turn to the question with which we began, and the question of how do you draw lessons out of this now 500 years later. So on the one hand, I'd love to get your thoughts on how do you make that hermeneutical leap from looking at 16th century sources to thinking about 21st century problems, and then also considering our contemporary context where the pandemic has certainly laid bare the fact that there's great wealth inequality in America. Are there lessons that you as a specialist in this period would draw that perhaps churches or perhaps even governments now could learn from these reforms that were new and innovative at the time? What can we do better here in an American context that they did in a German context 500 years ago?
Yeah, these are things I've thought about quite often. And there are times I will read laws that are put into place in the 16th century, and I would say that will never pass in the United States. But those laws were exactly trying to get at that wealth gap issue. They were very concerned about the gap between the rich and the poor. This was true not just of Lutherans, but definitely Lutherans, Reformed. You even see it among the Anabaptists, that they don't want there to be, because it creates social tension. And one of the things in this time period is they want to build communities. This is one of the main things they want to do, because once you define the community, you define who you are responsible for, who you need to take care of. And so one of the things about kind of 21st century applications, I would say, is one is community. Actually, I'll start there. Whoever the community is, whoever it's defined as, those are the people you become responsible for. Now, the boundaries of community are somewhat flexible, but when it comes to poor relief, they do try to become a little more clearer in the boundaries, because they want to know who should support this person. So an example that I've given is, let's say you have parents who attend the Lutheran church, but the kids followed their relatives and went to the Reformed church. The parents pass away and the kids become orphans, and the question becomes, who takes care of those kids? Is it the Lutheran church that the parents went to, or is it the church that the kids ended up attending, the Reformed community, because they followed relatives on the weekends? So then they have a debate about things like that. This also happens between Reformed and Anabaptist. So you get this sense of like, they need to define who you are, not just because they want to give you this strong identity and keep you in a box, but they need to define you so they know who is in charge or who is responsible for helping you. And so this effort to define community is definitely an effort, and maybe it's a little stricter in the 16th century than it would be today. But I do think that if you become a part of community today, you both have a responsibility to those who are in that community. And at the same time, those are the people, you might look to help you in times of need. And one of the things about the 21st century is we do have a little bit of a breakdown in community, partly because people are just shifting and moving all the time. A little bit of the consumerist culture makes people go in and out of certain communities depending on what benefits they can gain from it. So I think there is a little bit of a breakdown in that, but I think a commitment to community actually would help meet a lot of needs. Even if you think of something so small as if everyone just took care of their family and their relatives, I just think the people who are left really actually poor with no help would be actually much less. So one thing is a lesson about community. I think the second one, I'm going to come back to this wealth gap. The 16th century was very concerned about people who would do something what I call conspicuous consumption. They were aware that some people lived in lavish luxury and flaunted it. So this is a cultural shift, because today that's kind of good in some ways. But one of the reasons they were against this was because it made the people who didn't have aspire to just that. So it made people want to look wealthy, even though their families were hungry. And so they wanted to discourage, and especially they targeted young men, because they felt young men were the ones who could sort of spend all their money and not be responsible with their money. And so some of them, especially in Calvinist Geneva and the disciplinary records, you see the consistory really being concerned about how young men are spending their money, and especially if they're being wasteful. So one of the things that you see, both Luther tried to do this, but it didn't work. And Calvin only was able to do it after he won political support after 1555. But they begin to pass what I would call our moderation laws. They are laws against luxury. And the reason that is listed often is, with that money that you spent on all these luxury clothing items, by gluttony and drinking too much, all that money could have been used to help the poor, right? This becomes a constant refrain. Or when you do this consumption that's so conspicuous, you're setting a bad example, because you're telling people that's what they should aspire to, instead of moral uprightness or holy living or caring for their neighbor. And so you get this effort to try to control spending. And I think that one of the things that is tricky about that is, today, when we look back at that, we might simply say, oh, that's just a form of social control. That's just, they're just trying to regulate people's lives. And yeah, I mean, from our perspective, it may look like that. But you have to remember, what was their overriding purpose in doing that? It was actually to close the wealth gap. So I think that there are these lessons. I don't know if they would be put into place today, but I do think that they open our eyes to, if you want to try to solve something, then there has to be a little bit of discipline and a little bit of maybe discomfort. And then finally, I'll just add that one of the things as they try to solve poverty is they realize that one solution doesn't work all the time. So we might want to pass like a broad law that just takes care of everything, but just not going to work all the time, because people's situations are different, because some people will take advantage of the system, because some people will, leave their family members in a lurch. I mean, there are all kinds of scenarios that keep coming up. And so a lot of these poor relief administrators and alms officers and deacons, they're always trying to say, okay, this just happened. What are we going to do about this? How are we going to help this family? What are we going to do about these foreigners that just came in with like nothing? So they're constantly troubleshooting. And so I think that coming up with whatever policies we would come up with today, whatever we want to do as individuals or as churches or as organizations, I think it starts with your own community. And then from there, not necessarily know that whatever policy is put in place, it will not help everyone the same way. And already in the 16th century, they were very aware that employment, job creations, creating work for people to get them out of poverty, they already knew this in the 16th century. I'm actually very amazed, not at the beginning of the 16th century, I will say, it only comes up at the very second half or last quarter of the 16th century. But you begin to see these reformers, for example, Heinrich Bullinger in Zurich, he says, says to the government in his speeches, the government, all of you political leaders in this city, need to have a job creations program. And he actually outlines how they should do it. He has this whole elaborate system on how you're going to create jobs for these categories of people and how that's going to help the city get these people out of poverty.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, Bullinger was mentioned in one of the questions. So Jim West, who asked it, there you go. There's your answer on Bullinger. He's included in the book, I presume. So I know you've done a lot of work on him. I think what's so helpful about your response there is you recognize that there are themes that we can gather from the 16th century, but the implementation of those is so challenging in a different context. So you mentioned community, for example, and the fact that this is a fluid society now when it wasn't in the 16th century, and how difficult it can be to maintain community. So thank you for that. So I wanted to ask some very personal library questions, if I may. We got to know you, as you mentioned, because you've come to our library, you've worked with our collection. And particularly now in the pandemic world, it seems crazy that you would fly all the way from California to Atlanta to come work on a library when surely everything's been digitized, right? So can you talk a little bit about the value of libraries and the value of collections, particularly in a pandemic and post-pandemic world? How important is this work?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example for when I was at your library. I looked up online before I went all the sources that I thought I might need. Then I got one of the sources and I looked at it and I realized that the first part of the book is the source that's listed. But then the way they did a lot of books in the 16th century was they did collections. So what I quickly realized by actually looking at the book that I would have never gotten by maybe looking at the digital would be that it was actually 3 different treatises put together in one book. And they were also from different authors. They weren't even the same author. And one of the things about these libraries and the sources they hold is that it provides a window into the past. And without that, we don't know how we got here to the present. And so digitization is great. But for me, when I think of digitization, it's only a backup in the sense that I can only go to a digital source after I've seen the primary physical source, because then I know what I'm looking for and I know where to find it and I get a sense of the book in general. Now, I have started looking at some digital sources because we are in the pandemic and I'm just limited in travel. And I will say there's a deep frustration for someone like me who learns visually as well as just through reading. I get a lot by just looking at the thickness of the book. I get a sense of, when I look at the decorations in a book, I know how much money must have gone into writing it or producing it. There's also sometimes marginal notes, which can be sometimes fun. But I think the issue is digital format is good as a way to preserve some of these things. And it is helpful for, looking at it as a checking back on page numbers or things like that. But I don't think there's any substitute for looking at a print book. And I will say that I'm kind of, unusual maybe in this, but, I love old books, just the fact that I can hold a 16th century book makes me feel like I'm just doing time travel, which is a fantasy for most people. But you're actually holding something that was produced, read, and actually circulated in that time. So I just feel like it's just the window to the past. And if we were to lose that connection, I think we would really be it's as if we were walking around with amnesia. I use that analogy sometimes where, historical amnesia, meaning we just have lost our sight of our past. And so we're not sure how we got here. So I think that would be a major loss, actually. So I'm really a proponent of libraries, and I'm actually quite sad during the pandemic that our library is closed, that I can't assign research to my students as easily as I did in the past. I know some of my students are probably on the call, and the research project is available to some of them, but if I can't let them go into the library, show them the books, show them the special collections, then it is limited.
Yeah, thank you for that plug for libraries. I think it's important. We often use the example, if you look at a page that has gilded illumination on it, it's one thing to look at it on a computer screen. It's quite another thing to imagine sitting in a dimly lit room with candlelight bouncing off the page. Mm-hmm. And the visual experience of reading, it takes on a whole new meaning. And I think you only have to witness a group of students actually holding 16th century materials to realize there's just a visceral response that's quite different than seeing it on the computer screen. So we've had a number of questions come through the Q&A here on the side, and I won't get to all of them, but I do want to ask a couple of them. One gets back at the theological question. So many of us think about slogans like justification by faith, and one might oppose that to a mandate to care for the poor. So within the Reformation thinking, how do you square the idea of it is your faith that justifies you with, but you also need to go support these poor in our community?
Yeah, so this comes up quite a bit amongst the reformers, and you hear in their sermons how they are constantly trying to get people to support the poor when some might have just made the assumption, well, if I'm justified by faith and I no longer need to do these meritorious works, then why would I need to bother? And in fact, you get a lot of families who had given money to masses for the dead saying, hey, I want my money back. I want the foundations and the donations that I want it back. My family wants it back now. And so there is this sense in which the justification by faith could hinder that. So there's a couple of approaches. The most common one is simply to say, since you are justified by faith, out of thankful response, your good works will be the fruit of your faith. It shows that you actually have true faith if you do good works, right? So you will help the poor because you're now justified by faith. Because you've been made righteous, you will do righteous deeds. So one is that it becomes the outcome or the fruit of faith. The other thing is that even though it doesn't directly affect individual salvation, it does affect how God looks at you. So the whole notion of God saying, well done, good and faithful servant. Like if you want to hear that, you better do some good works, and also this idea that God is not happy with certain people. And it's not that, it's not that your salvation is at stake, but God is not happy with some of the lack of living out the faith that some people are doing. And then finally, I will add that although Luther emphasized justification by faith, righteousness is a passive righteousness that is received as a gift, there are other reformers, including his close colleague and friend, Johannes Bugenhagen, who in their table talks, Luther would say righteousness, through faith, and Bugenhagen say, well, what about the love of God as a gift? So you have other reformers talking about how does the love of God as a gift then infused in humans or in believers then come out? And so there is this effort to understand how the love of God is reflected. One last thing I will mention is Luther himself said that God doesn't need your good works, right? That's why you don't need to do them to be saved, because it's not like God sits around and says, I need some good works here. But he says very clearly, Luther says very clearly, but your neighbor does need them. And so even if good works are not needed by God, they are needed by your neighbor. And it then becomes the community, the believers' responsibility to then care for their neighbor.
I think that's so helpful. I mean, I think on the one hand, there's more nuance within an individual author than we often apply to him or her through a kind of slogan. And at the same time, this idea of the Reformation is misleading, that it is a diversity of reformations and various different opinions. So thank you very much for that. So I want to ask now, if people want to learn more, we all know that we're going to read your book, and I suspect that your book would be the #1 recommendation for how you could learn more about the argument you're put forward. But if there are another couple of recommendations you would offer to our audience about how they can learn more about this period or this particular piece of reform in this period.
Yeah, so one of my colleagues, Timothy Fehler, has written a book on Protestantism and poor relief. But I would actually say my favorite piece that he wrote is actually an article, which might be more, easier to read for people, that came out in 2017 called Creating Boundaries. And he still focuses on Emden, Germany. But one of the most intriguing things is he says poor relief divides by what language you speak. And I found that so interesting because once again, language becomes a way to create a community or a boundary for a community in this case. So they decided these poor relief, who was responsible for which poor relief by what language you spoke. And so I think these kinds of scholarship teach us that there are many ways to approach caring for the poor and caring for your community. Another book that I will mention is old Peter Grell's book, Brethren in Christ, a Calvinist Network in Reformation Europe. And I think that's helpful because you begin to see not just the usual poor relief, which is localized, regionalized, or pertaining to a city, but he looks at this international, transnational network of Calvinist donors and recipients throughout Europe. And I think it's the first time you get to, through scholarship, you get to really see how they are defining some communities through a particular confession, the minority reformed groups, and that confessional linkage throughout parts of Europe. And his book also has a whole chapter on donors, which I find fascinating because the donors, some of them are the people you might expect, but some of them are unexpected people. So they're just generous people who are not necessarily in the Reformed community, but who gave generously to it to support refugees in other countries. And so I think it's just nice to see that sort of variety of donors. And also you begin to see that part of the Reformation and poor relief is really dependent on wealthy merchants. There's a huge network of wealthy business families who are very involved in the poor relief of foreign refugees. And so I just think that it's a kind of a unique book for that. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. So we will put together a resource packet so you don't have to write down all of these titles. We'll make sure that you get all of that information that you need. So I'm sure we could go on for hours talking about this, but I promised everybody 45 minutes and we're at 46, so we're already over time. I do want to mention, though, that this is the first of 3 conversations that we will be having this spring. I'll place a slide here, which should show you our upcoming conversations. So on Wednesday, April 7th, we'll host Professor David Fink of Furman University for a conversation about wealth, work, and wisdom in early modern society. And then on May 5th, we'll be joined by Cynthia Molobita of the Church Divinity School of Pacific to talk about Luther's ethic of neighbor love. So both of those conversations will build on the groundwork we've laid here, but take it in 2 very different directions. You see the links there. Everything is available to you at pitts.emory.edu/Kessler Conversations. So Professor Chung-Kim, on behalf of my colleagues at Pitt's Theology Library and Candler School of Theology, thank you both for your time, but also for your expertise. We will all be checking out her book, right? Economics of Faith, Reforming Poor Relief in Early Modern Europe. I think pre-order now and it ships in early April. Does that sound right to you? Oxford University Press. So please check it out. To the rest of you, thank you for joining us. I wish you a safe rest of your week, and I look forward to seeing you at our next Pitt's Theology Library event. Thanks for joining us.